The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Rowan Ashfield finally found the cave. He hadn't been looking for it. He'd been looking for his missing goat, a stubborn, foul-tempered nanny named Biscuit who had a gift for finding holes in fences and trouble in equal measure. The cave sat low on the ridge behind his north pasture, hidden behind a curtain of overgrown bracken that the rain had beaten flat. Rowan pushed the wet ferns aside, squeezed his lantern through the gap, and immediately forgot about the goat entirely. They were stacked like sardines. 17 dragon hatchlings, each no larger than a barn cat, piled on top of one another in a hollow no bigger than a farmer's root cellar. Their scales, pale gray, barely pigmented, the color of ash before it fully cools, were dull and sunken. Their breathing was shallow and out of sync, a horrible papery sound, like wind through a dying wheat field. Several had their eyes open, but were not tracking the light. Their tiny claws were tucked inward. Their tail tips, which Rowan had been told curled upward like question marks in healthy hatchlings, were lying flat and still against the stone floor. Rowan was not a scholar. He had not read the Draconic Codex or studied under the mage wardens of the eastern reaches. What he knew from 43 years of farming: soil, seed, weather, and the particular language that living things spoke when they were close to dying. Every single one of these creatures was speaking it fluently. He set the lantern down. He sat on his heels. He looked at them for a long moment in the rain-muffled silence of the cave, and he thought about all the reasons a sensible man would back slowly out of this hollow and pretend he'd never seen a thing. Dragons, even hatchlings, were the sovereign ward of the Draconic Conclave. Interfering with nest sites, even abandoned ones, carried penalties ranging from exile to execution depending on which duchy you lived in. Rowan lived in the kind of duchy where the local magistrate had once fined a man for rescuing a conclave-marked falcon from a well. He thought about all of that. Then he took off his coat, shook it out as best he could, and began gently moving hatchlings onto it. The next 72 hours were the kind that aged a man. Rowan's farmhouse was not large, but it had a stone hearth that could hold a fire the size of a respectable bonfire, and he built one. He laid the hatchlings out on clean straw near the warmth. Not too close, because he didn't know their threshold for heat, and he wasn't going to guess wrong. He boiled water, let it cool to what felt like a mild summer stream against the inside of his wrist, and used a cloth to drip it against their sealed lips until the swallowing reflex kicked in. One by one, over hours, the reflex came. He did not sleep. Farmers learned, young, that some things couldn't be left unattended. When his neighbor Alara came by on the second morning to return a borrowed auger, she stopped dead in the doorway of his main room and stared at the 17 small gray shapes arranged around his hearth like a peculiar collection of sleeping gargoyles. Alara was a practical woman, nearly 60, who had once set her own dislocated shoulder using a fence post and a piece of rope. She looked at Rowan. She looked at the hatchlings. She looked at the faint color, still pale, but no longer ash-gray, beginning to return to their scales. "Conclave's going to hang you," she said. "Probably," said Rowan. She took off her own coat, hung it by the door, and said, "What do they eat?" The answer, as it turned out, was everything, but they needed to be coaxed. Rowan tried raw meat first, rabbit, then chicken, then the salted pork he'd been saving. The hatchling sniffed at it and turned away. He tried fish from the stream. He tried eggs, cracked directly into a shallow bowl, which two of the bolder ones eventually investigated with their tongues. He tried boiled oats sweetened with honey, which seemed absurd, but one hatchling, the smallest, a female with a single dark streak running from her left eye to her jaw like a tear mark, ate 3 bowls of it with aggressive, single-minded focus. "She's going to be trouble," Alara observed. "The stubborn ones survive," Rowan said. He called the streak-marked one Pip, because naming something you were trying to keep alive was not sentimentality, it was commitment. It made you fight harder. He'd learned that from Biscuit, who had, by the way, turned up in his kitchen 3 days later, completely dry, having apparently found her own way home and let herself in through the unlatched back door. Rowan did not question this. He simply filled her water bucket and went back to the hatchlings. On the 8th day, 2 of them died. There was nothing to be done about it. 2 had been too far gone when he'd found them, their lungs too damaged by what he guessed was damp and cold exposure over many days. He buried them properly, under the old oak at the edge of his north field, and he stood over the graves for a while in the gray morning light. 15 remained. He went back inside and got to work. The conclave arrived on the 22nd day. There were 4 of them, robed in the deep burgundy of senior wardens, riding horses that cost more than Rowan's farm. They had a parchment with a seal on it. They had, behind their carefully composed official expressions, the particular look of people who had expected to arrive and find charred bones, and instead found something they did not have the vocabulary for. What they found was 15 dragon hatchlings, healthy, alert, and in several cases actively annoying, distributed throughout a farmhouse that had been reorganized entirely around their needs. The hearth, the sleeping straw, the careful food rotation that Rowan had worked out through 15 days of meticulous trial and error, documented in a battered notebook in his cramped farmer's hand. The window latches adjusted so that the 2 who discovered they could open them couldn't get out unsupervised. Pip, sitting on top of the grain chest like she owned it, watching the wardens arrive with narrow, measuring golden eyes. The senior warden, a tall woman with iron gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed by very large creatures, looked at the notebook Rowan held out to her. She looked at the hatchlings. She looked at Rowan, who was unshaven, visibly exhausted, and absolutely unbothered by her presence. "You are aware," she said carefully, "that interfering with a draconic nest site is a capital offense." "I'm aware," Rowan said. "The nest site was abandoned. The mother didn't make it. You'll find her remains about 200 yards up the ridge, if you haven't already. These hatchlings had been alone for at least 5 days before I found them. Even so, the law." "The law," said Rowan, in the tone of a man who had been awake for most of 3 weeks and had run entirely out of deference, "was written to protect dragons. These dragons, the ones that are alive right now because someone decided the law was less important than the thing the law was meant to protect." The warden looked at him for a long time. Pip, from the top of the grain chest, made a sound, not quite a chirp, not quite a growl, that managed to convey a distinct editorial opinion. "The notebook," Alara said helpfully from the corner, where she'd been pretending to mend a harness, "has everything. Feeding schedules, temperature preferences, behavioral notes. The one near the window, Rowan calls him Flint, doesn't like being approached from the left. The 2 near the hearth are sisters, and they'll both panic if you separate them. It's all in there." The warden took the notebook. She read several pages. Her expression shifted through several things that weren't quite readable and settled somewhere that wasn't quite the expression she'd arrived with. She closed the notebook. She looked at her colleagues. She looked at Rowan. "The conclave," she said finally, "will require a full debriefing, a pause, and your continued cooperation in their transition to a proper facility." "Pip stays until she's ready," Rowan said. "She's not ready." The warden looked at Pip. Pip looked back at the warden with the absolute confidence of something that had been fed, warmed, and told implicitly every day for 3 weeks that it mattered. "Agreed," said the warden quietly. Later, when the wardens had gone and the farmhouse was full of the small, warm sounds of sleeping hatchlings, Alara handed Rowan a mug of something hot and sat down across from him. "You know they're going to put your name in the conclave records," she said. "Humans don't get put in the conclave records." Rowan looked at Pip, who had migrated from the grain chest to the arm of his chair and was currently using his shoulder as a pillow. "I wasn't trying to get in a record," he said. "I was trying to keep them alive." Alara raised her mug. "Same thing," she said. "For humans, it's always the same thing." Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Through the farmhouse window, the stars were coming out over the north pasture, cold and very far away, and, for the first time in 3 weeks, not threatening anything at all. Rowan let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding since the moment he'd pushed aside those wet ferns and held up his lantern. Some things couldn't be left unattended. He'd always known that.